Welcome to WCG Talks Trials, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of clinical research, sharing the latest trends, insights, and best practices from experts across the industry. In each episode of WCG Talks Trials, we'll explore a different area of the clinical trial industry, while featuring a diverse range of clinical research and medical professionals. If you're passionate about advancing clinical research, improving patient outcomes, and driving healthcare forward, then WCG Talks Trials is the right podcast for you. We are so glad you could join us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joanne Thomas, clinical reviewer and patient advocate at WCG, and I'm thrilled to be your host for today's episode discussing the IRB and ethical considerations in clinical trials. Before we dive in, let me remind you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on your favorite listening platforms like Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify, so you never miss an episode of WCG Talks Trials. We are joined today by Currien MacDonald, Medical Chair Director at WCG. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Let's start with a question about an IRB's role in research. If you don't know, the IRB or Institutional Review Board is a group of people who looks out for the interests of humans participating in research. First question, and this is a two-part question. What role does an IRB play in trials, and is it one-time or ongoing? And how much confidence should the public have in a study if an IRB is involved?
Very deep, intelligent question. Thank you very much. So the IRB's role in clinical trials is required by regulations, and it's, as mentioned above, to protect the rights and welfare of human research participants. That's the IRB's mission. So once the IRB approves a study, the IRB has oversight of that study until the closure. That's every site, every location, research activities. This oversight includes written procedures from the IRB to ensure that new changes in research are sent to the IRB before those changes are executed, unless immediate changes are needed to avoid hazards to participants, as well as to ensure that the IRB reports to the FDA and other appropriate bodies unanticipated problems involving risk to participants or others, and serious or continuing non-compliance with regulations or the IRB's requirements. With that, the IRB has the authority to require modifications to the research to meet the IRB criteria for approval and to suspend or terminate research that is not being compliant or for which there are problems with it. The IRB is uninvolved with the researchers and therefore acts as an independent third party in this oversight. And among its responsibilities, including those above, the IRB needs to be qualified through the experience and expertise of its members to promote the respect for its advice and counsel to safeguard the rights of participants in research.
Thank you. The next question is, how does an IRB work with the FDA?
Exactly. As noted above, the IRB reports to the FDA for certain things that are required by regulations to report, but the IRB doesn't really work directly with FDA. In the context of a research study, the IRB and FDA have parallel but separate roles. The FDA has a very broad charge, and according to their mission statement, is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human drugs, biologic products, and medical devices. So a very broad overview. And this extends the review of the use of investigational products and research studies as they progress forward through to and applied for approval for general use. The IRB does not have a scope of responsibility in that way. We, the IRB, look at individual research studies entirely to protect the rights and welfare of the human research participant in those studies. We also act to confirm individual research studies are compliant with the regulations of research, including FDA regulations for FDA-regulated products. So very large, broad, powerful FDA and very narrow, single-focused IRB reviews. Again, parallel but separate.
Thank you. Is there anything that ethically prevents a researcher or other staff from being involved in a study?
Great deep question. Yeah, researchers, whether physicians or not, and all research staff need to have the appropriate qualifications to perform their role. The lead researcher, or primary investigator as they're often called, has overall responsibility of everyone on their team, and their qualifications are the most stringent. This lead investigator or PI qualifications are reviewed by the IRB to have that investigator be approved to conduct the study and lead the team. Considerations of qualifications include the investigator's experience in the field of study and their experience with other research studies. Before such considerations, however, are those factors which may prevent a researcher from being involved regardless of their qualifications. For example, financial or other conflicts of interest with this lead researcher or someone on their team, as well as any history of misconduct or similar issues in their path that would not have the IRB have confidence that they would be good to be leading this project.
Thank you. What would qualify as a conflict of interest for clinical research personnel? For example, what if they have personal bias? For example, a family member was diagnosed with the medications indication, or the researcher previously worked at an advocacy group fighting for a cure for that disease.
Yeah, thanks. I mentioned conflicts of interest previously, and so that is a great question to follow. There are some financial factors which may have an investigator have an objective conflict of interest regardless of other factors. For example, having a significant amount of control over the company that makes the product would have a reasonable person think that the investigator would potentially have a bias toward ensuring that company did well. Even if the person may not individually have that, a reasonable person's second view may. Other factors may also have the investigator either be biased or have the appearance of being biased. We want to make sure that research is the absolute highest quality. So, for example, institutional interest or having a family member with significant financial holdings, those might be other examples of individual conflicts of interest. The idea of a conflict of interest is that the research has an opportunity to potentially gain personally from the outcomes of the research such that their ability to perform their duties as a researcher consciously or unconsciously may be compromised. So other factors that may motivate a researcher, including having a family member diagnosed with a condition or having a professional dedication for the condition being studied, those motivations do not necessarily indicate that the researcher will personally benefit from the specific outcome of a study. In very black and white terms, getting a drug approved or a bias towards an outcome that gets the drug approved is different in the two situations. The former is someone who will make money off that drug being sold regardless of outcome. The latter is someone who will have a drug to treat a loved one. In the former instance, having an ineffective drug approved doesn't help the latter situation at all. Similarly, the motivation to produce treatment for a condition is only met by a drug that actually works. So this conflict of interest is only relevant in kind of those former situations.
Interesting. What are the ethical principles a researcher is required to uphold before, during, and after a study that the IRB oversees?
Great. There's books written about ethical principles. But in summary, all investigators need to have both clinically specific training for the condition. So think of medical school, residency, and all those sorts of training, as well as training specifically for research and human subject protection ethics. Again, a lot of things in that requirements. However, in short, there's been a long history of a lack of appreciation for research ethics, thus having established standards such as good clinical practice as a requirements for investigators to be trained on prior to performing human research. Those researchers who are licensed also follow the requirements of their licensure, which have their own separate codes of ethics. The research ethics, to quote one that is a great read for someone, is the Belmont Report. It's not too long. And those ethical principles that guide IRBs include respect for persons, as well as administrative issues such as holding information confidential.
Thank you. How, if at all, are the IRB's requirements for protocols being adjusted to account for the unique specifics of psychedelics research?
Yeah, psychedelics are a very interesting topic right now and have a lot of history and baggage with it. Again, hours of talk right there. But for this specific question. One of the wonderful things about IRBs is their criteria for approval and the processes and procedures that the IRBs have set up to protect the rights and welfare of the human research participant are geared to expect novel and unique situations. We're reviewing research that is going where no one has gone before, so we need to be expecting the unexpected. Research is often going into the unknown or encountering specific situations for which standard practices have failed. In other words, the IRB requirements don't need to adjust to account for unique specifics of a research project, as we're already anticipating unique specifics and are designed to be ready for them. For example, one of the requirements of the IRB is to have sufficient experience to review the research which is being seen by it. The requirement addresses situations and categorizations of unique situations that may be encountered by the use of specific drugs or populations. So, for example, the IRB that is reviewing a psychedelic research study needs to have the experience of people who are used to dealing with the drug or the population. That requirement addresses the situations that are come up with those and may be encountered by use of those drugs or populations, as I just said. Similarly, the unique specifics of a novel approach to disease are more like the novel approach to other diseases that dissimilar, even though the diseases may be individually quite different. That is, these ethical principles that the IRB uses to review studies are principles that can be applied to situations regardless of their specifics.
Thank you. Can a clinical trial adequately study all potential risks? Is it possible for the sample size to be inappropriately small, yet still approved by an IRB? And who decides the appropriate size?
Oh, very complex question. I'll try to be clear about all the threads that are tied in there. So first, each clinical trial has a specific objective. The ability of the study to meet that specific objective is evaluated by the IRB. The number of data points in the plan to be done in the study and collected in the study are there to achieve the objective, and that is part of the calculus that the IRB uses to determine if a study is approvable. If the objectives appear to be unreachable by the study design, the IRB would question the study's ability to meet the IRB criteria for approval, and if not, then they wouldn't approve it. One study is generally not sufficient to establish under what circumstances the intervention is reasonable to use. In other words, the risks of the product are usually established over a series of studies and include the consideration of unknown risks. The possibility of significant or substantial risks at a meaningful frequency, they're best seen over the full set of that data. That consideration of risks and effectiveness of the drug for use by the general public is an FDA consideration. Again, that very large scope. In more granular detail, the appropriate size of the study and the overall series of studies' ability to assess risks and efficacy have well-established scientific standards for significance. That is, there's common rules that are in place for how many data points are needed to meet an objective. The numerical value of the benefits likely being due to chance and the risks seen during clinical studies have established an adequate pattern. That is not to say some risks exist at such a low frequency or have other confounding factors making it nearly impossible to detect without very large sample sizes or that only exist outside of a clinical trial. To catch these, FDA has set up reporting capabilities for gathering individual reports after a product has been approved and continues to monitor these reports for the need to remove a product from the market. FDA may also require studies after the product is on the market, specifically follow up on these issues. For example, some oncology drugs are approved because there's such an unmet need and the drug looks as though with the data so far, it would be beneficial and able to be used. And then FDA requires a study to not limit that drug's potential benefit while they're still getting last bits of data to see if the larger body of data would still support it.
Thank you. Why do exclusion and inclusion criteria exist for a study? Doesn't that inherently create bias and risk? Some of the potential safety concerns of the drug not being discovered until after approval?
Great. And that exactly was what I was hinting at before about some of the risks or issues coming up only outside of a research study. That is, the two primary functions of the inclusion and exclusion criteria are to minimize the risk to the participants and to control for variables in the study. The first is somewhat simple. For example, a new drug showed potential in the lab of having kidney risk when used in people with kidney problems. Early studies in humans with the drug would have an exclusion criteria that does not allow people with those kidney problems into the study, even though the drug may be looking for diseases or treating diseases that have people with kidney problems. Then, if those studies done in people without kidney problems shows there are no significant safety concerns related to the kidneys, a later study may expand to people with mild or moderate kidney problems or some other factor like that to confirm that the drug is well tolerated in that population. On the other side, if those early studies show there is a significant risk, a restriction could become part of the drug's approval that has the labeling indicating what to do in people with reduced kidney function. That drug label would let prescribing doctors know not to give the drug to people with kidney problems, or if there's an unmet need and no other treatment options, the labeling may suggest, again, modifications of treatment or renal dosing or something like that. On the other hand, if the same example drug did show issues in people with normal kidneys, the drug development might stop unless there was enough benefit to try to find a way to minimize or reduce the risks that come from the use of people with kidney problems. The section function is closely related. Inclusion and exclusion criteria are also used to limit factors that would make study results difficult to interpret. Again, studies as a progression towards a final outcome. That is, having the exclusion for similar related diseases to a narrowly defined condition in another study. This may not be for safety reasons, but to provide clear data on the treatment's effect on the study condition. Hinting at those confounding variables, if I have a study for which the data is so confounded that I can't tell whether the research question was answered, that's not a good study, even if it may not be what happens in real life.
Thank you. How is it determined whether a safety concern is attributable to the study drug or not?
Following right out of that confounding factors, exactly. The careful attention to the participant's health and welfare during a research study largely falls on the individual investigators. With this, it is the investigator's duty to record the adverse events noted during the study and mark them as either related or unrelated to the research intervention. That's just absolute standard for all research studies. While simple on paper, this is really difficult to do in practice, and results are more best estimates of probable relationship. The sponsor also has a responsibility to review adverse events reported by the investigator and determine whether they require changes to the research. So the sponsor also does a review of their view of the same events or similar events being reported, not just by this investigator, but other investigators. For example, one investigator reports an adverse event as being related to the study intervention. Other investigators report similar adverse events, but not being related. The sponsor does their own review and notes the lack of evidence to support an adverse event, having a reasonable mechanism of action from the drug, for example, or another explanation that the sponsored research has proven that is more likely to have caused the adverse event than the study intervention. That overall data shows a different view than the investigator without that knowledge. This specific example does highlight that the ability to correctly identify adverse events as being related to a study product increases over time with more knowledge of the study product. The sponsor, in amassing their data and getting from all the investigators reporting them, will be able to better assess whether an individual investigator's report of adverse events or not are related or not related, or how they are interacting with the study product.
How is it determined what is and isn't considered an adverse event?
Adverse events are defined in the drug regulations. There any untoward medical occurrence associated with the use of a drug in humans, whether or not they're considered drug-related. Individual research protocols establish any specific sub-definitions, for example, adverse events of special interest or others. But an adverse event is an adverse event regardless of the relationship.
Thank you. Is it possible for a research institution to underreport adverse events? And how, if at all, would this be discovered and when?
So an individual is required by regulations to prepare and maintain adequate and accurate case histories that record all observations and other data pertinent to the investigation for each individual participant. Again, that's just the expectation and standard. Some adverse events require prompt or immediate reporting to the sponsor. Otherwise, all data, those that don't require prompt or immediate reporting, are submitted to the sponsor on a regular basis, including all of these adverse events. Not all adverse events require prompt reporting to the FDA or the IRB that may require reporting to the sponsor. So there's a third layer. The FDA will review the sponsor's data, that is all the data from all the adverse events and the PI's attribution and the sponsor's attribution of related or not related, that we just discussed. When the FDA reviews that sponsor's data as the program progresses, they'll be looking at that not just for the standard objectives. Are they risks or what are the benefits? How are the objectives that are being met? They're also looking at the quality of the data. That is, it is possible for a research institution to not appropriately report information and not appropriately report promptly reportable information. But it would take substantial effort to fraudulently erase data that has been reported, so it wasn't part of the data review. That is to say, it would show up during one of these regular quality checks of the data.
Thank you. Can a researcher or its institution intentionally manipulate the data to look better than it is? And how is traceability of clinical data ensured?
It's exactly on a larger scale to what we just talked about. A researcher or a sponsor could manipulate data to have their product or a study look better than it was. And that's why these questions are hard, because it's liars and cheats, right? In the modern age, however, this is quite challenging, as it would require extensive layers of research fraud in a system that's designed to prevent such fraud. Again, with FDA and everyone along the line, including IRBs, looking at data not just for effectiveness, but for quality, these systems are set up to ensure that their review is saying, okay, you're going to get quality of data. For example, individual data, including adverse events or effectiveness data, are captured in real time at the source of the data. Without knowing the full spectrum of data, manipulating the data to achieve a specific end without being obviously fraudulent is very hard. Any manipulation past the source data would be discoverable as the required source data reconciliations that happen during study progress and review. There are practices upon which all researchers are trained, become force of habit for how to record and collect source information. Again, to produce manipulation of data at that level would require manipulation of each of the records of the source data, as well as the timing and capture of the source data. Otherwise, the manipulations would be apparent and caught. At the IRB, we see reports of this fraudulent being caught pretty regularly. Along those lines, the repercussions for research fraud are also so severe that there are very few historical instances of this being done, and each one has demonstrated substantial negative outcomes vastly outweighing any potential gains.
Thank you. How can misconduct by clinical research personnel be detected? And what is the standard way for clinical trial participants to report complaints about their participation in a clinical trial?
Great. And that kind of follows up with that last question too. The clinical research misconduct of any kind has several layers of opportunities to be caught. So not manipulating data, just acting badly. Research misconduct has the scrutiny of all other researchers involved, with no penalties and substantial support for others on the research team bring research misconduct forward. Similarly, there are open opportunities for participants to report misconduct. As mentioned above, any of the attempts at fraud, including covering up inappropriate behavior, become aberrations in a system designed to catch aberrations. Clinical trial participants are told during the consent process and documented in the consent form that they have two separate ways to bring forward concerns, complaints, or questions. The first, for kind of general concerns, complaints, or questions, is to the research staff themselves to try to address those complaints. The research staff are generally best able to appropriately address the common complaints that participants have once made aware that they are issues. The second way is in an independent party's contact information if the staff are not able or not appropriate to address the concern. This independent party, often the IRB, who again is separate and independent from the researchers entirely, can be contacted at any point and manages the questions, concerns, complaints, or issues about the research participants' rights in the research study.
Thank you. The final question is, what are some important elements that WCG reviews for when conducting an informed consent form review?
As mentioned, the disclosure to participants of this contact for questions, concerns, complaints, both in the researcher and the IRB, is one of the informed consent elements. There's a bunch of others. The IRB requirements for information that is in the consent form, they're long, substantial, and they're all listed in the regulation. The key components include identifying that the study involves research, its purpose and expected duration of a participant's being in a study, that participation is voluntary and without penalty, and context for questions, as I mentioned above. The consent form also needs to provide appropriate and adequate disclosure of the procedures that are part of the research, the risks of the research, any potential benefits of the research to the individuals or others, and any alternative participation, as well as to the extent of which confidentiality will be maintained in the research study. Now, that's what's required to be in there. The consent form cannot include language that waives or appears to waive any of the participants' legal rights to pursue a claim for injury, or releases or appears to release the investigator, the sponsor, the institution, or its agents from liability for negligence. Again, if there's a bad actor, the participant can always bring up legal repercussions.
Thank you. Before we wrap up, I want to thank you, Currien, for joining us today and sharing your insights and experiences on this episode of WCG Talks Trials. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you have any questions or would like more information about this topic, please feel free to visit wcgclinical.com. We hope you found this episode insightful and that you'll join us for future episodes of WCG Talks Trials.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of WCG Talks Trials. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred listening platform as we continue to explore different areas of the clinical research industry. As always, we encourage you to join in the conversation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics you'd like to hear on the show by visiting us at wcgclinical.com/podcast. We're here to serve as a trusted resource as we work to improve lives and accelerate clinical research together.